Money is one of the most pervasive forces in human existence, yet it remains one of the most misunderstood. We are taught to view finance through the lens of mathematics, spreadsheets, and cold, hard logic. We are told that if we simply follow the right formulas and input the correct data, our financial futures will be secure. However, this perspective ignores the most volatile and influential variable in the entire equation: the human mind. This book is not a guide on how to read a balance sheet or pick the next unicorn stock. Instead, it is a deep dive into the complex, often irrational psychology that governs every dollar we spend, save, and invest. Why is it that a janitor who saves diligently can retire with millions, while a high-powered executive with an MBA can end up in bankruptcy? The answer rarely lies in their respective levels of intelligence or their access to information. Rather, it lies in their behavior. Financial success is not a hard science like physics or chemistry. It is a soft skill where how you behave is more important than what you know. This journey will take us through the hidden corridors of our own biases, the historical accidents that shaped our modern economy, and the personal narratives that dictate our financial destinies. Throughout these pages, you will discover why our personal histories act as a filter through which we view every economic event. You will learn why the concepts we take for granted, like retirement and consumer debt, are actually historical infants that we are still learning how to handle. We will explore the massive, often invisible role that luck plays in our successes, and why the ability to keep wealth is a completely different skill set than the ability to acquire it. By the end of this exploration, you will not only understand the markets better, you will understand yourself. This is an invitation to rethink everything you thought you knew about the relationship between your mind and your money, moving beyond the numbers to the human stories that truly drive the world. This book serves as a comprehensive map of the psychological landscape of modern finance. We will move away from the traditional economic models that assume every person is a rational actor, making perfect decisions to maximize their utility. Instead, we will embrace the messy, emotional reality of human life. The core theme of this work is the psychology of money, the idea that our financial outcomes are primarily driven by our behaviors, our unique life experiences, and our individual tolerances for risk and uncertainty. We will explore several foundational concepts that will reshape your worldview. First, we examine the sliver of reality principle, which posits that no matter how much we study, we only ever experience a tiny fraction of how the world works. Second, we look at the historical newness of our financial tools, recognizing that as a species, we are still greenhorns when it comes to managing modern wealth. Third, we will dissect the long tail of success, realizing that a few massive wins often compensate for a lifetime of small failures. As you read, expect to be challenged. We will look at the Great Depression not just as a set of statistics, but as a traumatic event that rewired the brains of an entire generation. We will analyze the success of art moguls and the tragic downfalls of Wall Street legends. This orientation is designed to set the stage for a paradigm shift, moving from a mindset of calculation to a mindset of behavioral awareness. By understanding these psychological levers, you can build a financial life that is not only prosperous but also resilient and sustainable. To understand how people interact with money, we must first accept a fundamental truth. There is no such thing as a universal economic experience. We all live in the same global economy, but we perceive it through vastly different lenses. These lenses are polished by the era in which we were born, the socioeconomic status of our parents, and the specific geographic and political climates we navigated during our formative years. While we might all look at the same stock market ticker or the same inflation report, the truth we extract from those numbers is entirely dependent on our personal history. Consider the narrative of the Great Depression, an event that looms large in the American consciousness. For most of us, the story is one of universal catastrophe. We envision the bread lines of the 1930s, the dust-covered faces of farmers losing their land in the Midwest, and the frantic crowds outside shuttered banks. Following the 1929 stock market crash, the United States entered a period of unprecedented decline. The Roaring Twenties, defined by jazz, excess, and speculation, vanished overnight. In its place came a decade where families were evicted from their homes, savings accounts were wiped out by bank failures, and the national psyche was gripped by a profound sense of hopelessness. This is the standard historical account, and for millions of people, it was a lived, agonizing reality. However, even an event as massive as the Great Depression did not affect everyone in the same way. When John F. Kennedy campaigned for the presidency in 1960, he was confronted with his own privilege regarding this era. Voters wanted to know if a man of his immense wealth could truly empathize with the struggles of the common citizen who had survived the 1930s. Kennedy's response was remarkably candid. He admitted that his family, the Kennedys, were already substantially wealthy when the market crashed in 1929. Far from being ruined, their fortune actually expanded during the subsequent decade. By 1939, at the tail end of the Depression, the Kennedy family lived in a larger mansion and employed more domestic staff than they had at the start of the crisis. Kennedy confessed that he didn't truly grasp the magnitude of the suffering around him until he arrived at Harvard University and began reading about the economic devastation in his textbooks. His depression was a scholarly subject, not a visceral memory of hunger. This realization was pivotal for Kennedy. It allowed him to acknowledge his blind spots and eventually convince the American public that he could lead a nation whose struggles he hadn't personally shared. This story illustrates a crucial point. Two people can live through the exact same 10-year period and come away with diametrically opposed views on the stability of the world. This divergence of experience isn't limited to the ultra-wealthy versus the poor. It applies to every single one of us. Imagine two children growing up in the same city. One is the son of a Manhattan stockbroker who sees wealth as something to be managed and grown through strategic risk. The other is the son of a farmhand who has watched his father struggle with the unpredictability of weather and the cruelty of debt. These two individuals don't just have different bank balances, they have different operating systems for their brains. The stockbroker's son learns that risk is a tool. The farmhand's son learns that risk is a threat to survival. Furthermore, consider the impact of inflation. If you reached adulthood during a decade where the price of bread and gas doubled every few years, your view of saving is fundamentally different from someone who grew up during a period of price stability. To the person who lived through high inflation, holding cash feels like watching an ice cube melt in the sun. To the person who lived through stability, cash feels like a safe harbor. Neither person is wrong, but their behaviors, what they buy when they invest, and how they react to news will be wildly different. We often fall into the trap of thinking we have a complete grasp of how the world works. We look at data and believe we are being objective. In reality, we are only ever experiencing a small sliver of the total human experience. We know much less than we think we do because we cannot truly feel the emotions of a situation we haven't lived through. You can read about a market crash, but you cannot know the physiological sensation of losing 50% of your net worth unless you have sat at your kitchen table and watched it happen. Understanding this gap, the space between information and experience, is the first step in mastering the psychology of money. We must realize that every person we meet is making financial decisions based on a history that we might not understand, but which makes perfect sense to them. Traditional economics often treats human beings as if they were sophisticated calculators. In the world of academic theory, we are rational actors, entities that look at all available data, weigh the pros and cons with cold precision, and then make the decision that maximizes our long-term financial health. It's a beautiful, tidy theory. The only problem is that it bears almost no resemblance to how real people actually behave in the real world. Real life is messy, emotional, and driven by immediate needs that a spreadsheet can't capture. One of the most striking examples of this irrational behavior is the way low-income households interact with the lottery. In the United States, The average household in the lowest income bracket spends approximately $411 per year on lottery tickets. To an economist, this is insanity. This same demographic is often part of the 40% of Americans who would struggle to find $400 in the event of an emergency, such as a car repair or a medical bill. From a purely mathematical standpoint, these individuals should be saving that $411 to create an emergency fund. They are literally gambling away the very safety net they desperately need. But if we stop looking at the math and start looking at the psychology, the behavior starts to look less like madness and more like a strategy for hope. If you are living paycheck to paycheck, working a dead-end job with no prospect of a promotion, the idea of saving $400 over a year doesn't feel like a path to freedom. It feels like a drop in a bucket that will never be full. However, a lottery ticket represents something that a savings account doesn't: a non-zero chance of a completely different life. It is the only time in their week where they can realistically imagine buying a home, taking a vacation, or securing their children's future. They aren't buying a mathematical probability. They are buying a dream. While it may not be rational in a textbook, it is logically consistent with their lived experience. This concept of personal history driving financial calls was explored in depth by economists Ulrich Malmendier and Stefan Nagel in a landmark 2006 study. They didn't just look at 1 year of data. They scrutinized 5 decades of information from the survey of consumer finances. Their goal was to pinpoint exactly what determines an individual's willingness to take financial risks. What they found was a powerful confirmation of the experience over education theory. Malmendier and Nagel discovered that an investor's appetite for risk was largely determined by what the economy was doing when that investor was in their late teens and early 20s. These formative years create a psychological imprint that is incredibly difficult to erase. For instance, if you were a young adult during a period of rampant inflation, your brain was wired to view bonds as a losing game. Even if inflation later stabilized and bonds became a great investment, you would likely remain bond-shy for the rest of your life. Your gut reaction, formed in your youth, would override the current data on your screen. The same phenomenon applies to the stock market. Consider the difference between someone born in 1950 and someone born in 1970. For the person born in 1970, their early adulthood, the late 80s and 90s, coincided with one of the greatest bull markets in history. The S&P 500 increased nearly tenfold during their formative years. To this person, the stock market feels like a wealth creation machine that always goes up in the long run. Now, contrast that with the person born in 1950. During their early adulthood, the market was essentially stagnant, moving sideways for years while inflation ate away at their purchasing power. To this person, the stock market feels like a dangerous, volatile trap. The most fascinating part of the study was that these individuals didn't change their minds even when the market conditions changed. The person who grew up in a stagnant market remained cautious even during the boom of the 90s. They weren't being stupid. They were being loyal to their own life experience. We like to think we are making decisions based on the future, but we are almost always making them based on the past. Our financial logic is really just a reflection of the world we've seen with our own eyes. When we understand this, we can stop judging others and ourselves for irrational choices and start looking for the underlying experiences that make those choices feel like the only way forward. To understand why we struggle so much with modern finance, it helps to look at our canine companions. A toy poodle sitting on a velvet cushion bears almost no physical resemblance to a gray wolf hunting in the wilderness. Yet, if a squirrel darts across the yard, that poodle's ancient, predatory instincts will kick in instantly. Despite 10,000 years of domestication and selective breeding, the wolf inside the poodle hasn't been fully bred out. The dog is living in a modern living room, but its brain is still tuned to the ancient forest. Human beings are in a very similar predicament when it comes to money. We live in a world of high-frequency trading, complex tax-sheltered accounts, and digital currencies, but our brains were evolved for a world of immediate survival, bartering, and physical commodities. In the grand timeline of human history, the economic concepts we use today are not just new, they are historical infants. We are trying to navigate a 21st century financial landscape using a brain that is still adjusting to the very idea of currency. Let's put this in perspective. The first actual coins weren't minted until roughly 600 BC by King Alyats in Lydia, modern-day Turkey. While 2,600 years might seem like a long time, it is a blink of an eye in evolutionary terms, and that's just basic currency. The truly complex structures that define our lives today are much, much younger. Take the concept of retirement. We treat retirement as if it were a natural stage of life, like childhood or adolescence. But for the vast majority of human history, people worked until they were physically unable to do so, or until they died. In the 1940s, even with the advent of early Social Security, half of all American men over the age of 65 were still in the labor force. Life expectancy was lower, and the idea of spending 20 years playing golf or traveling was a luxury reserved for the ultra-elite. It wasn't until the 1980s that retirement became a realistic goal for the average worker. This was the decade when Social Security payments finally rose to a level, roughly $1,000 a month when adjusted for inflation, that could actually support a modest lifestyle without supplemental income. Think about that. The standard American retirement is only about 40 years old. That's only 2 generations of experience. We are essentially beta testing the concept of retirement in real time. The tools we use to fund this retirement are even newer. The 401k, which is now the primary vehicle for private savings in the U.S., didn't even exist until 1978. It was originally an obscure provision in the tax code that wasn't intended to replace traditional pensions. The Roth IRA, another staple of modern planning, wasn't introduced until 1998. If you feel confused by your retirement options, it's because these options are younger than most of the people using them. The same newness applies to almost every pillar of our economy. Index funds, which have revolutionized how we invest, are only about 50 years old. Hedge funds, as a mainstream investment class, only really took off in the last 25 years. Even the concept of widespread consumer debt, mortgages, car loans, and credit cards is a post-World War II phenomenon. Before the GI Bill was passed in 1944, it was incredibly difficult for an average person to borrow money to buy a home. Our entire debt-fueled economic growth model is less than a century old. This historical context is incredibly liberating. It suggests that if you find money management difficult, it's not because you are inherently flawed or bad at math. It's because you are a member of a species that is trying to master a brand new set of tools. We are all greenhorns in this environment. We are like pioneers who have just landed on a new continent. We are still figuring out where the fresh water is and which plants are poisonous. When we realize how new these concepts are, we can stop demanding perfection from ourselves and start focusing on basic, sustainable behaviors that help us survive this infancy of the financial age. In the world of business and investing, we love to celebrate the self-made individual. We devour biographies of billionaires, looking for the specific habits, morning routines, or secret strategies that led to their immense wealth. We want to believe that success is a simple equation: talent plus hard work equals prosperity. This narrative gives us a sense of control. If we can just replicate the inputs, we assume we can guarantee the outputs. However, this mindset ignores a factor that is often more powerful than talent or effort combined: blind, dumb luck. The author once asked Robert Shiller, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, what he most wished he could quantify about the world of investing. Shiller's answer was telling. He wanted to know the exact role of luck in successful outcomes. The fact that one of the greatest economic minds of our time considers luck to be the ultimate unknown should give us pause. Luck is a taboo topic in polite financial circles. To suggest that someone's success was due to luck feels like an insult, a way of diminishing their hard work. Conversely, to suggest that someone's failure was due to bad luck feels like an excuse. But the data suggests that luck is not just a peripheral factor, it is often the deciding factor. Consider a study by economist Bhaskar Mazumdar, which looked at the correlation between the incomes of siblings. He found that the income levels of two brothers are more closely correlated than their heights or their weights. Think about the implications of that. If your brother is tall, you have a good chance of being tall, but it's not a guarantee. But if your brother is rich, the statistical likelihood that you will also be rich is incredibly high. Why is this? It's not necessarily because of shared genetics for business savvy. It's because siblings share the same luck of birth. They grew up in the same neighborhood, had access to the same schools, were introduced to the same social networks, and likely had the same safety nets provided by their parents. They were born into a specific pocket of opportunity. If you find a pair of wealthy brothers, however, they will almost certainly tell you that their success was the result of their individual hard work and unique choices. They are victims of a psychological bias that makes us blind to the role of chance in our own lives. This bias works in two directions. When we succeed, we attribute it to our character, our discipline, our vision, our grit. When we fail, we are quick to blame bad luck. The market turned, the government changed the rules, or an unforeseeable event occurred. However, when we look at asterisk others, we do the exact opposite. If a competitor's business fails, we don't say they were unlucky. We say they were lazy, short-sighted, or arrogant. We judge ourselves by our intentions and others by their results. Our culture only reinforces this delusion. Take a magazine like Forbes Asterisk. It is filled with stories of maverick investors who made reckless bets that happened to pay off. They are hailed as geniuses and visionaries. But for every one of those geniuses, there are 100 other investors who made the exact same reckless bets and lost everything because the timing was off by a week or a month. Forbes doesn't write about the unlucky versions of these investors, even though their process might have been identical to the lucky ones. This creates a dangerous pickle for anyone trying to learn from the success of others. If we only study the winners, we are learning from a skewed data set that overemphasizes the role of skill and ignores the role of chance. We end up trying to emulate outliers, people whose success was the result of a perfect storm that can never be replicated. So how do we handle the reality of luck? The first step is humility. We must recognize that our successes are never entirely our own doing, and our failures are rarely entirely our own fault. This doesn't mean we should stop working hard, but it does mean we should build randomness into our financial models. We should aim for a margin of safety that can withstand a streak of bad luck. By acknowledging the hidden hand of chance, we can stop chasing the perfect strategy and start building a resilient, one that can survive the unpredictable winds of fortune. In the annals of Wall Street history, few names carry as much weight as Jesse Livermore. Born in 1877, Livermore was a titan of the early 20th century stock market. He was a man of legendary intuition and nerves of steel. By the time he was 30, he had amassed a fortune worth roughly $100 million in today's currency. He was the quintessential success story, a man who had mastered the art of the trade. Livermore's greatest moment came in 1929. While the rest of the world was caught up in the euphoria of the great bull market, Livermore sensed a shift. He took a massive short position, essentially betting that the entire market would collapse. When the crash finally hit, it was a bloodbath. Investors lost everything. The news was filled with stories of ruined men leaping from the windows of their Manhattan offices. Livermore, however, returned home to his family with a different story. In a single day, he had made the modern equivalent of $3 billion. He was quite literally the king of the world. But the story of Jesse Livermore does not have a happy ending. Just over a decade later, in 1940, Livermore walked into a Manhattan club and took his own life. He was broke, heavily in debt, and a shadow of his former self. How could a man who was smart enough to make $3 billion in a day lose it all? The answer lies in a fundamental psychological truth. Getting rich and staying rich are two completely different skills. Getting rich requires you to be a risk taker. It requires optimism, courage, and the ability to swing for the fences. You have to believe that the future will be better than the past, and that you have the power to capitalize on that growth. Jesse Livermore was a master of this. He was bold, aggressive, and unafraid of the big bet. But the very traits that made him a genius at acquiring wealth made him a disaster at keeping it. Staying rich, on the other hand, requires a psychological ball game that is almost the opposite of getting rich. Staying rich requires humility. It requires a healthy dose of fear, the constant awareness that everything you have could be taken away by a shift in the market, a change in regulation, or a simple stroke of bad luck. Staying rich is about perseverance and survival. It's about recognizing that your past success was at least partly due to luck, and that luck is a fickle mistress. After his 1929 win, Livermore fell into the trap of success-induced arrogance. He began to believe that he was the reason for his success, rather than a beneficiary of a specific set of circumstances. He placed larger and larger bets, convinced that he couldn't lose. But the market eventually did what it always does. It changed. And because Livermore didn't have the humility to change with it, or the fear to protect what he had, he was wiped out. This isn't just a story from the history books. It happens every day. Roughly 40% of all publicly traded companies eventually lose 100% of their value. The Forbes 400 asterisk list, which tracks the wealthiest people in America, has a turnover rate of about 20% every single decade, not counting deaths. Wealth is naturally leaky. It wants to dissipate. The entrepreneurs and investors who actually last, the ones who stay on the list for decades, all share a common trait. They are a little bit paranoid. Michael Moritz, the billionaire venture capitalist, famously noted that the most successful firms are the ones that operate as if they are always one mistake away from ruin. This fear isn't paralyzing, it's clarifying. It forces you to look at every potential gain through the lens of what could go wrong. When you prioritize survival over winning big, you paradoxically end up winning bigger in the long run. You stay in the game long enough for the power of compounding to work its magic. The lesson of Jesse Livermore is that no matter how much you make, you are never above the market. The skill of keeping money is the skill of being humble enough to know that you might be wrong, and being fearful enough to make sure that even if you are, you'll still be around to play tomorrow. If you were to look at the early life of Heinz Berggruen, you wouldn't see the makings of a financial titan. Berggruen was a man of letters, not numbers. In 1936, he was forced to flee his home in Nazi Germany, arriving in America with little more than his education. He studied literature at Berkeley and eventually found work as a journalist and art critic. He was a man with a sideline passion for modern art, not a career in high finance. In 1940, Berggruen made a modest purchase, a small watercolor by the artist Paul Klee for $100. It was a purchase made out of love, not an investment strategy, but it sparked a lifelong obsession. Over the next several decades, Berggruen quietly amassed one of the most significant private collections of modern art in the world. By the time he sold his collection to the German government in 2000 for 100 million euros, it was estimated to be worth over $1 billion. His portfolio was a who's who of the 20th century: Picasso, Klee, Matisse, and Braque. On the surface, it looks like Berggruen was a visionary who had an uncanny ability to spot winners before anyone else. But a study by the investment firm Horizon Research suggests a much more interesting and more applicable reality. Berggrun's success wasn't because he was right about every piece of art he bought. It was because he understood the principle of the long tail. The long tail is a statistical concept which states that in many systems, a tiny number of events are responsible for the vast majority of the outcomes. In the world of art collecting, this means that a collector can buy hundreds of paintings that turn out to be duds, pieces that never increase in value or even become worthless. But if that collector happens to buy one Picasso or one Matisse, the massive, tail-end return of that single masterpiece will more than compensate for all the other failures. Horizon Research found that all great art collectors follow a similar pattern. They buy in huge quantities. They don't just pick one or two pieces. They buy everything they can get their hands on that shows even a glimmer of promise. They spread their risks across a wide field. Then they wait. Over time, the duds fall away, and the winners begin to emerge. The trick is to hold on to those winners until the total value of the collection is driven almost entirely by the top 1% of the portfolio. Berggrun's collection was, in essence, a modern art index fund. He wasn't trying to be a stock picker for art. He was trying to capture the entire tale of the modern art movement. He knew that if he owned enough pieces, he was statistically guaranteed to own a few that would become legendary. This principle applies to every form of investing and business. In venture capital, for instance, a firm might invest in 50 startups. They expect 40 of them to fail completely. They hope 9 of them will do okay. But they are betting their entire future on the one startup that becomes the next Google or Amazon. That single tail event is what creates the fortune. This is a profound realization because it changes how we view failure. Most of us are terrified of being wrong. We feel like every investment we make has to be a winner. But the long tail tells us that we can be wrong 90% of the time and still end up incredibly wealthy. The key is not to avoid failure, but to ensure that our failures are small and our successes are tail-sized. When you understand the long tail, you stop worrying about the 99 duds in your collection. You stop obsessing over the small losses and start focusing on staying in the game long enough to hit your Picasso. Success in money is not about having a high batting average. It's about what you do when you actually connect with the ball. You don't need to be a genius every day. You just need to be not wrong long enough for the math of the universe to work in your favor. As we conclude this exploration into the psychology of money, the most important takeaway is a shift in perspective. Financial health is less about what you do in the market and more about what you do in your own head. We have seen how our personal histories create shards of truth that we mistake for the whole reality. We have recognized that our modern financial system is a newborn experiment, and that we are all, to some extent, stumbling in the dark as we learn to use it. The stories of Jesse Livermore and Heinz Berggruen serve as bookends for the human experience of wealth. Livermore teaches us that the ego is the greatest enemy of wealth preservation, while Berggruen shows us that the long tail of success allows for a massive amount of failure along the way. These aren't just stories about money. They are stories about the human condition, our need for control, our susceptibility to greed, and our amazing capacity for resilience. If you want to move forward with a healthier relationship with money, start by acknowledging the role of luck in your life. This will give you the humility to protect what you have and the empathy to not judge those who have less. Secondly, prioritize staying in the game over winning the game. The greatest force in finance is not a high return. It is time. The longer you can survive without being wiped out, the more likely you are to encounter your own tail event that changes everything. Finally, remember that money is a tool, not a scorecard. Its ultimate value is the freedom it provides, the ability to wake up in the morning and say, I can do whatever I want today. That freedom doesn't come from having the most complex strategy or the most aggressive portfolio. It comes from having a deep understanding of your own biases and a disciplined approach to your own behavior. The psychology of money is a lifelong study, but it is the only study that truly pays off in the end. May your journey be one of both prosperity and, more importantly, peace of mind. For more book summaries for free, install Zyroverse.